When was your first visit to Palestine? And is there a scene that comes to your mind of that time?
And I have to say, the most important impressions I got were of my family being everywhere, scattered partly, some of them living in Beirut, some of them living, as I say, in Amman and elsewhere, and many of them living still in Jerusalem or still living or in other parts of Palestine, Nablus, Ramallah. And I still have family there. My brother lives in Ramallah. I have cousins in Jerusalem. But I also have family everywhere else. Like all Palestinians, we are everywhere. It is very ironic because one of the motivations for the establishment of Israel was this situation of the Jewish people persecuted and scattered, as you say. And the irony is that in creating a Jewish state in a country that at the time had a large Arab majority, they in turn scattered and dispersed a people who had been living in their homeland peacefully for a very long time. So it's a tragic irony that the establishment of Israel caused the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, driving them from their home.
Over the past half a century, how much or less has the Palestine changed?
It's changed a great deal because that half century, I've actually been going for more than half a century, but that half century since the 60s witnessed the Israeli occupation of Jerusalem and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. It witnessed the absorption of those territories, the slow process of absorption of those territories into Israel, the settlement of hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the occupied territories, mainly in Jerusalem and the West Bank. It witnessed enormous changes. So when I used to go before 1967, I would visit Jerusalem that was under Arab control. I visited an Arab city under Jordanian control. I now visit a city that is completely controlled by Israel, where Palestinians are second-class citizens, and where Israeli policy involves settling Jews and preventing Arabs as much as possible from living in Jerusalem. And that's just Jerusalem. Similar processes are taking place in the West Bank. What is it like? It's very strange to be there because I'm an American citizen. I can travel anywhere in Israel or in the occupied territories. But many of my family who live in the occupied territories cannot travel inside Israel. So they can't move in most of the country. And when they move, they have to go through Israeli checkpoints, which can make it very, very difficult to move. So I experience the mobility of an American, even though I'm also Palestinian, but most Palestinians don't have that advantage. And that's one of the most striking things, the way in which the Palestinians, most Palestinians inside Palestine, their lives are restricted and their lives are constrained and their movements are highly regulated. I'm not even talking about repression. I'm simply talking about not being able to go from place A to place B. Most Palestinians in the West Bank cannot go to Jerusalem. Nobody from Gaza, almost nobody from Gaza, can go to the West Bank. The situation there now is very grim for Palestinians. But at the same time, I think the important thing to realize is that this is a colonial situation, which I think is something that Koreans can relate to because of their own suffering with Japanese colonialism for many decades, for many generations. Even before Japan formally annexed in 1910, Japan was penetrating and taking over Korea and absorbing it and controlling it. And so I think the Koreans should be able to relate to the fact that that's how Palestinians understand the process that's going on. Obviously, for Israelis, it's seen differently. For them, this is the recreation or the creation of a Jewish state, which is their right, which is rooted in the Bible and so on. But from a Palestinian perspective, we were here, we were living peacefully, and these mainly Europeans come and they establish a new political forum to take over our land. So it was not just a colonial regime that was imposed, it was a settler colonial regime. In the case of Korea, the Japanese did not try and settle Korea. They controlled it, they took it over, they exploited it, they exploited Korean labor, they exploited Korean resources. They did what a colonial power does, what Britain did in Egypt, or what France did in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. In our case, this was a settler colonial process where a new people was introduced, a new population was introduced at the expense of the existing population. And I think that the two things that I try and stress in the book are, firstly, that that's the real nature of the conflict. This is not just two peoples fighting one another. This is not Germany and France. This is a settler colonial process where a new population is introduced. In the case of Israel, they have established a nation state, a people. But that's not unique in settler colonialism. The United States is a settler colonial state. And in the United States, we've established a new state and a new people. There's an American people. So to say that Israel is a nation and the Israelis are a people does not contradict the origins of this whole project as a settler colonial process, like the United States, like Australia, like New Zealand, like Canada. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the Palestinians have never stopped resisting this process. Like the Koreans, they were overtaken by force. Japan was a superior power. Japan was supported by the world. The world accepted colonialism in the first half of the 20th century. The great powers supported Japan when it occupied Korea, when it occupied Taiwan, when it occupied Manchuria, and so on. Nobody stopped them. Nobody objected. And Israel has the same kind of international support, but the Korean people never stopped resisting. Some collaborated. It always happens under occupation. That's not unusual. In fact, it's normal. For some people, it's the easiest way, and it is very common. But the Korean people resisted, and the Palestinians have resisted. Of course, the way the Japanese described Korean resistance was, these are bandits, these are outlaws, these are terrorists, and that's exactly the way Israel describes Palestinian resistance. The resolution has to be on a basis of equality. Both groups have to treat one another the same. You can't say, we deserve these privileges, or we have these rights which we deny you. That won't work. I was involved in negotiations myself. I was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation that attended the Madrid Peace Conference that President George H.W. Bush and Secretary of State Baker organized in Madrid in 1991. And I was involved in the negotiations that followed, that took place at the State Department for almost 2 years, until 1993. And I think the principle that I mentioned of equality is really the problem. There is no recognition by Israel or by the United States that this is a solution, that the solution has to be based on equality. The Palestinians are always put in a position of inferiority in these negotiations. We were not allowed to negotiate all of the important issues in the almost 2 years that I was engaged in negotiation. There is no recognition that the Palestinians have an absolute right of self-determination. There's no recognition that the Palestinians are people with the same rights, or should have the same rights as Israelis. It's always Israel's security has to be first. It's always Israel has the right to settle and the Palestinians don't have the right to resist, and so on and so forth. So I think if you don't adopt the principle of equality as the basis for a negotiation, and you don't accept certain givens, then you're not going to have a solution. The United States, in my view, has prevented a solution by accepting the Israeli position, really from way back when, from the 60s until today. And I think that as long as the United States monopolizes the process of negotiation, and as long as the United States accepts Israeli premises, you've had Israeli governments really since the 1970s that don't really recognize that the Palestinians are a people that have the absolute right of self-determination. You don't have that. Israel has passed a law which says basically the entirety of Palestine has one people. Only the Jewish people have the right of self-determination. In 2018, the Israeli Knesset passed a law to that effect. It was called the Jewish Nation State Law. What they basically said is, we have established as a constitutional principle that only one people in this entire country has the right of self-determination, the Jewish people. But as long as you have that as a basis, what are you going to negotiate? We negotiate that we don't exist? That's nothing to negotiate. Why do you need us to negotiate that? You are stating that and demanding that and putting your foot on our neck until we accept it. We will never accept it. No, you're completely right. I think it's a mistake to talk about these as peace negotiations, because the Israeli government has explicitly said, we're not going to enter into fundamental negotiations with the Palestinians. We will discuss with them minor measures like this, letting a few more things into the Gaza Strip, allowing a few more people to have residence, allowing some businessmen to have permits so they can go through this horrible checkpoint system. And as you say, these are rights that people should normally have. A country should be able to have its customs dues instead of the Israelis holding them, or taxes withheld from Palestinian workers who work in Israel. Israel arbitrarily decides it will allow the Palestinians to have what should be their rights or not, depending on how they feel. And so you're completely right, actually. These are not measures towards peace. These are measures simply palliatives. These are, what's the word? They're meant to sweeteners for maintenance of the status quo. We will continue to occupy. We will continue to colonize. We will refuse to negotiate real peace, but we will throw you a few minor carrots. Exactly. Let me just say one more thing. There was much criticism among Palestinians of the Palestinian leadership that was willing to accept these bribes in exchange for maintenance of a terrible status quo. There was much criticism. Sooner or later, they will create a one-state situation. I mean, many people have argued it is a one-state situation. Already, the 800,000 Israelis who live in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem live within Israel as far as they're concerned. They operate under Israeli law. They pay Israeli taxes. The Israeli army defends them. The Israeli electricity system, everything. They're integrated by roads, by telecommunications, by law into Israel. The Palestinians don't have those advantages, of course. Palestinians living under Israeli occupation are treated as citizens under occupation, like Koreans were under Japanese occupation. And the Israelis seem to not realize that they are creating a one-state reality, which sooner or later, the world is not going to accept. Maybe later, it may take a long time, but you cannot create one sovereign entity and say these people have these rights and these people have lesser rights. In the 21st century, that's a very hard thing to do. Certainly for a country that proclaims itself to be democratic, certainly for a country, most of whose support comes from the United States and Western Europe. So I think you put your finger on it. They are creating a one-state reality in which the inequality between Israeli Jewish citizens and everybody else is going to become more and more glaring. They're also going to create a reality, as long as people are deprived of rights, where there's going to be constant friction. There's going to be constant tension. There may be violence. And this will not be because the Palestinians are unreasonable, wild people. It's because they're being put into an intolerable situation and given absolutely no alternatives. And we saw this last spring in May, when the situation just exploded because of constant seizure of property in Jerusalem. It triggered constant encroachments on Palestinian worship rights in Jerusalem and around the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The situation just exploded. Nobody planned it, nobody organized it, it just happened. And those encroachments continue. As long as Israel continues to do this, stealing Palestinian land, evicting Palestinians, putting Israeli Jewish citizens in their place, you're going to have anger, frustration, resistance, and sometimes, unfortunately, violence. It's a necessary, inevitable, natural reaction to what Israel is doing. And as long as they continue to do that, that problem continues. I would just make one point about the Arab countries, which is most Arab countries are not democratic. And if you look at the polling, which has been done consistently, public opinion polling, most people in most Arab countries are very supportive of the Palestinians. Their governments, their unrepresentative autocratic governments may not be, but public opinion is. And so to some extent, the Palestinians are dependent on the process of democratization in the Arab world. Hopefully that will change in the Arab world. And that will simply mean that public opinion will be able to affect the policies of these countries and force Israel to take that into account. When the Palestinians have had a more unified national movement, they have had more of an impact than they're able to have right now. That too can change.